I'm Naya, mom, boob nerd, board-certified lactation consultant, and lover of lipstick and curse words. I'm that weird Indian girl you knew in high school, all grown up.
And I'm Alexis, mom, birth nerd, and therapist plus doula, encouraging parents to hold joy plus what the fuck is this mess simultaneously. Some people think I'm too much, but those aren't my people. And we are the Top Knot Squad. TKS is a tiny little podcast about motherhood in real life, the good, the bad, the ugly AF.
Hosted by two women that are passionate about our beliefs and unafraid to speak our minds.
Friends that wanted to create space for all that ish we are too scared to talk about.
Are you ready to laugh, be vulnerable, and keep it real with us?
Top knots are not required.
If the Top Knot Squad content makes you laugh, nod in agreement, or makes you feel less alone, we'd love your support in the cost of producing this podcast. Visit patreon.com/TopKnotSquad to learn more about our budget-friendly sponsorship tiers and how you can help ensure that TKS has a future. Every little bit helps. On today's episode, we'll be talking about bias. Bias penetrates all aspects of our lives, from workplace bias to bias in mainstream media to bias in education. TKS has focused on maternal mortality in a previous episode this season, but today we'll be looking at one of the many factors that impact the high rates seen in the U.S. Bias, specifically bias in birth. This encompasses racial biases, biases based on sexual orientation, and beyond, all impacting marginalized communities already at risk for negative birth outcomes. Our guest today is Jennifer Sarduy, mama, activist, and founder of Re+Birth Equity Alliance. Jen is a community organizer with several organizations working to hold space and encourage accountability with issues that affect her community. Primarily, she works with Re+Birth Equity Alliance, an organization she co-founded to address disconnection within birth justice. Within Re+Birth Equity, she helps to organize mobile mental health clinics and community-based adult sex ed conversations. She travels regularly for Re+Birth Equity to train birth and family workers on implicit bias management and systemic racism in birth. She is also involved with a local harm reduction nonprofit working to ensure that people who use drugs are safer and better understood in Fort Worth. In her free time, she enjoys making fish faces at the fish in her aquarium in order to seem more relatable and making up elaborate excuses to avoid school fundraisers. Welcome, Jen. We're so glad to have you.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here avoiding a school fundraiser at this very moment.
School fundraisers are the worst.
They should just have a thing like, can you write us a check for $50 and that'll cover you for the whole year, and then you're done. And then you don't have to do fundraisers.
Yes. I saw a friend that lives in Colorado that they did that at their school. They were like, look, this is how much you'd spend throughout the year. Would you like to write a check? And I'm all about that option.
I have a question already that wasn't in our notes. I know that oftentimes equity and equality are used interchangeably. So I was just curious if you could kind of share with our audience what the difference is.
Yeah, absolutely. So equity is like, have you ever seen that graphic where there's a kid looking over a fence standing on some boxes and then an adult standing next to them that can already see over the fence? So equality recognizes that some people need a step up in order to see the same playing field. Equity recognizes that some people need more than one step up. They are in the ground. They're not standing on the same field. And in order for, everyone to be the same, that means that we're actually working towards a society that doesn't have those barriers. We're actually working to get the ground level instead of just putting Band-Aids on solutions and putting boxes under feet. We're really working to get the ground level and have everyone actually be able to accomplish the same things with the same amount of ease in their lives.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great way to explain it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just was, I was thinking about that when Naya was reading your bio. And, I figured you guys intentionally use the term equity. And oftentimes those words get confused.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Let's dive into bias. For the first discussion point, I kind of have a definition of bias, and I'm going to read it aloud for our listeners. Bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Do you think that that's a pretty solid definition for us to kind of base this discussion off of?
Yeah. So, and bias is when it's considered negative. So we all have bias. It's only to be avoided when it's considered negative. You can't avoid bias altogether because we all have it. And it's like through our education and through our upbringing and through, just the neighborhood we live in, we develop all of these thoughts. And so to me, implicit bias is the culmination of that, like mentally, and how you can't escape your upbringing, no matter how hard you try. Any therapist will tell you that, right?
Yeah.
You can't escape it. Those thoughts are something you have to continuously work to like deprogram and work against and recognize that you're like doing something that you don't want to be doing. And so bias kind of works like that. It's just negative evaluations of groups, and you really have to kind of dig into them instead of shying away to them in order to combat that.
And how is bias different from stereotyping?
So stereotyping would be considered like an explicit bias, which is like an outward, what you would consider overt racism, which is an outward expression of a belief. So when people have implicit bias, they're not necessarily acting on those things or realizing that they influence their decision-making at all. Which is, if you don't know that it's influencing your decision-making because you're not, you don't know that it should be a priority for you to look into it and recognize that, then that can be super dangerous. And that's kind of what we have going on in society right now, is that it's not a priority for our elected officials, really, to work with less bias or to work on bias management strategies. So we have laws in the books that are like inherently biased because who's writing our laws?
Right.
Right, exactly. Like people in power,
white men,
are
yes,
generally white men, and they it doesn't matter to them. Implicit bias has no, kind of sway with them because it doesn't have to. Like they don't have to think about it.
Right.
And
they
so
have all the
our job as a society is to like make them think about it. You know?
Yeah, I think, too, I often hear in regards to, when we're talking about implicit bias, someone who's being called out for it is often like, the response is like, well, I'm not racist. I'm a good person. Like, I'm not blatantly, being racist towards someone or hateful towards someone. I'm a good person. I'm colorblind. Like, that's the narrative around it.
I have black friends.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where
I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it.
And so just kind of on that note, since I feel like we talked a little bit about everybody already having biases, can you share a little bit about why it's important for people to understand and acknowledge that they have implicit bias? Because I think it's easy enough for us to all just be like, oh, well, I guess everyone has a bias, and kind of shrug our shoulders and just walk away from the conversation instead of sort of leaning into the unpacking a lot of shit, basically.
Oh, that's a big question. Okay, so really, like, when I teach implicit bias, we do bias management, and that's very, that's on purpose. Because if you don't know that there's a way to fix something, it's really hard to commit yourself to really digging deep into it. And debiasing techniques largely consist of self-awareness. So in workshop, I'm generally saying like, hey, you have to like be aware of when you're doing this, or catch yourself doing it, or catch yourself after, and then hold yourself accountable through different techniques. And if you're not doing that, then you need to be in therapy. That's what I say. And it's so true because, awareness is the only way to fix it. And if you can't bring yourself to be self-aware, then that's like a larger problem, and you're not paying me enough to tell you about it. But yeah, I would definitely say that the reason that it's important for us to consider looking at this is that it's the only way to fix it, and it really does matter. Stigma stigma in care, disparities in care, when you look at those reports from like our task force and maternal mortality task force in Texas, their highest recommendations are like end racism.
Mm-hmm.
How do we end racism? Is we have to be aware of it. We have to call it out. And so if we're not calling it out, then people are going to continue to die.
Mm-hmm.
So just to add to that, there are not just maternal mortality task forces and groups looking at this, but even big non-governmental organizations and health orgs like ACOG. In doing some research to come up with questions and talking points and stuff for this episode, I did some Googling and I fell down so many rabbit holes, Jen, so many on this topic. But one thing I read was that ACOG actually recommends implicit bias training for all of their providers. So it's not just task forces that are saying this. It's people who have, done research, and it's not just, it's a big picture. It's a big thing, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And then also like it has real life consequences that I think it's easy to forget when you're using academic terms that usually get used in bias training, but like real life consequences such as people who are stigmatized are less likely to seek out care. Black people are systematically like undertreated for their pain relative to their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
We're using like stigmatizing language, decision-making bias, where like our decisions, when we're making decisions in a practice or in our businesses, we're not checking for bias within our decisions. And that is like making our decision less friendly to the people that actually need the care, and we're not even aware of it. So there's just so many real life consequences to, not having any kind of implicit bias management training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even you were making me think, Naya, about I went to some conference. I'm drawing a blank on what the conference was. It was through ACLU. I don't remember. If I remember, I'll include it in the notes. But it was a conference, and the majority of the attendees were medical students. It was primarily about it was a reproductive justice conference, and they mostly talked about abortion and policy related to that. But there was one like breakout that I went to where it was literally a room full of medical students, and it was about bias in medicine. And like pretty much all of them were kind of sharing that one, implicit bias is like not a part of their curriculum in med school, and it's not a priority for administration to make that so. And so I just find that really interesting, like based off what you said about if that's ACOG's recommendation, like where is this starting?
Exactly. Yeah. How are they implementing it?
Yeah.
They should. I don't know that they are.
They need to call you.
They need some like resources. And I actually had a conversation with someone from ACOG, I guess this was almost a year ago now, about like them compiling implicit bias resources.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know where that list went. Did you see it linked when you were looking it up, Naya?
I didn't. This was just, I think, I have to look back through my laptop history, but I think it was from 2016 or 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
And so they may not have had compiled all that information in the packet of info that I found.
Mm-hmm. Which, too, when I was at that conference, because you know Courtney, right,
Mm-hmm.
Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a trauma-informed training, and we struggle to get medical professionals to attend. It's usually very doula, midwife, lactation consultant, childbirth educator heavy, and we can't get doctors or nurses really to attend. And so when I was at that conference, I was kind of asking, since these med students were surrounding me, I was just like, hey, like, would you be interested in this? Like, how do we get this, sign you guys up?
Mm-hmm.
And they were like super eager. So that's also making me think, like, have you had that issue as well? Like getting into the door with actual medical professionals, or are they listening?
So I have, that's really hard. They don't want to come to anything that doesn't have something in it for them, generally, in my experience. So We pay for CEUs generally if we're like trying to do something like that, or, but CEUs are really easy to get. So there really has to be something else there. And there's not really anything that a bias trainer like a Re+Birth can offer a provider that we've told as a society that their time is worth $400 an hour. There's like nothing I can give you except like you kind of have to have the desire. So midwives have been really receptive to training, which is nice. Doulas have been really receptive to training. But like, again, I feel like trauma-informed care training is something that like every provider needs.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's just come because it's the right thing to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have deep, kind of
which we
moral
probably
thoughts about that.
Yeah, we probably accidentally end up having conversations about bias in our training because, I mean, one of the biggest things we're talking about is race-based trauma, which is not often included in a trauma-informed conversation. And it's like racism is the trauma.
Word.
So, it's just interesting. If there's any medical professionals listening, please reach out and tell us why you don't show up.
I'm not calling you in, but why don't you come to the training? Oh, gosh. Yeah.
So on that note, can we talk a little bit about the implicit bias and how it can present itself during pregnancy, labor, and postpartum? And then whether there's anything that a consumer can look for or a birthing person can look for that may show like little hints that their provider has some biases or that they're not being treated with the care that they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really hard to control bias in our faces. So that shows up a lot in that, like, people who have, so say there's a provider that I have that has bias against Black women or something that tells them that, like, Black women are less compliant as patients. I get a less enthusiastic greeting generally from a provider like that. But a lot of times it comes up as providers not believing their patients or not believing them as easily as they would believe their white counterparts. So, for example, I come into a first appointment and I ask you, hey, Naya, how many pregnancies have you had?
3.
Okay. And how many abortions?
Well, 1 miscarriage.
Okay. And how many stillbirths?
0.
So, like, that question was asked and answered the first time I asked, how many pregnancies have you had? Mm-hmm. But me continuing to rephrase that question as if you're, like, not smart enough to answer it honestly and correctly the first time is a problem. And so what I tell providers is that I understand that you're trying to get certain information and make sure the information is accurate, but a good way to not show bias within that interaction in particular would be to just say up front, I'm going to ask you what may feel like the same question several different ways, and this is why. So interactions like that, where I've put your back up because I'm asking you the same question several different ways, and not listening to your responses, really, it feels like now your blood pressure is high because you're stressed out because I'm not listening to you. Mm-hmm. And then I take your blood pressure and tell you about how your blood pressure is high, which doesn't help your blood pressure. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it spirals out from there and just really affects quality of care throughout your whole birthing process. It's a tragedy, truly.
I know that with a lot of births that don't go according to plan, or where where the birthing person experiences some trauma following the birth. What is, in hindsight, kind of being 2020 and looking back and seeing what are now very, very obvious signs of implicit bias or just not good treatment from your healthcare provider? What is a good way for a birthing person to go about getting justice isn't quite the right word, but just making sure that their views are heard by this healthcare provider?
Wow, that's a really good question. So I would say that the first thing that is important to do is to have a support person in the room. So that's really hard for some people and easier for others. But I think that having a witness to what is going on, one, makes everyone behave better, but two, gives you a second account of what happened. So once you have, if you have a second account of what happened, then you can go ahead and you leave reviews. Reviews are great. Set up a time to talk to that provider. But again, I haven't heard of people having much success with hey, I'm out of your care. I'd like to talk to you about the care I experienced. I haven't had great success with people doing that. Generally, what gets a response is a formal complaint to the state board.
Okay. Which is a lot to ask of a survivor.
Yeah, truly.
Yeah.
It's a lot to ask. And so sharing with your networks and asking your providers, your other providers, to have that conversation, because hopefully you're ensuring that your providers are culturally competent in the care that they provide prior to. But if that doesn't happen, and you don't have someone that can speak for you, that's really the only recourse we have. And again, I think that just goes back to how our system is set up, and we're set up that certain people have more, their time has more value than others in our society. That's just how it is. And so it's hard to get your voice heard when you're not considered worth, you're not the most, I guess, lucrative use of attention.
Yeah, this also makes me think of, the terms are leaving my brain. Just from I'm thinking of risk reduction versus primary prevention. So what we're talking about now, about that person after the fact, something horrific has happened. They didn't receive the type of care that they deserve. And the onus is on them to then report or have a conversation about it or try to make the change. And that's not, that's putting that onus on them. And that kind of leads into that risk reduction, which risk reduction is more of what can I do to prevent this from happening? But again, the onus is on the person.
Right.
Whereas that primary prevention is the system. The system is fucked up, and we have to do the work to shift the system, which is this huge task and is overwhelming.
Definitely. And this is my whole story. Naya knows my life story, I'm sure, at this point. But this is kind of how I got into this work, is I had a really bad kind of racist, just kind of all over awful experience giving birth to my first child. And I didn't know how to not have that experience again. And so I eventually found midwifery, because that was not something that my mom had any experience with. So I didn't know that I didn't know something, and so I eventually found midwifery and had my middle kid with a midwife, and still felt powerless. Even though my midwife was amazing, I still felt there was something I was missing, and that I needed to trust myself in some way. And so my third kid was pretty much unassisted at home. And I put myself in so much danger doing that. In hindsight, I hope that my children and the people that I, am organizing for in my community never feels like they have to go to such extremes to feel like they have ownership of their birth experience. But that's what drives me to this day, is that I had no recourse after that first experience,
Man, that resonates with me. If I ever had a third kid, I always think about, there's no provider in Austin. There's no birthing place in Austin that I want to go to. And I honestly have said that out loud before, that I just want to be one of those people who can labor quietly and not tell anyone that it's happening. And then oops, I just had a baby by myself at home. Because that's the only way that it feels like I would be truly safe.
Yeah.
Ugh.
I feel that, sis.
Oh. Whew.
I know, heavy stuff. Sorry, Lee. Okay, so we talked a little bit about implicit bias and with birth. I know you talked a little bit about just the questions that you asked me that a provider would ask. Any other examples? Maybe less. Well, again, that one, I feel like that one wasn't very obvious either. And can we talk a little bit about microaggressions here? Just because I feel like it's so related to this and it plays a huge role with implicit bias. Can you talk a little bit about what they are and how they can hurt, really?
Yeah, so these things are so closely related. A lot of times you can use microaggression to describe things that happen due to implicit bias. So they're super closely related. Microaggressions have been described as like death by 1,000 cuts. So they're like brief, commonplace, daily occurrences that, thinking of a word. Oh, my words are so gone. They're like, I guess, indignities. Like they're brief, commonplace, daily indignities, and they can be intentional or unintentional. And they essentially communicate like derogatory or negative feelings towards members of marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. And they also can be like communicated through words or action. Mm-hmm. So microaggressions are like, that's a pretty wide berth of things to cover within that term. But discrimination and microaggressions do contribute to like poor health by contributing to like high levels of cortisol, right? Mm-hmm. So you have like your stress hormone is high, and that leads to weathering, which is a phenomenon in which the health of African American women starts to deteriorate in their early 20s. So just
really young,
our bodies break down due to like racism, due to like socioeconomic disadvantage. So we do an exercise and training about corrosive disadvantage and how like little decisions that we make in life can have a ripple effect on how we're doing later in life, and the decisions that we make and how we feel about ourselves. And so all of these things, although they seem small and they're just, I said something wrong, no big deal, it can really affect someone's life physically, their physical being. Words that we say can put them in physical harm. And so that's really important to remember. So like while people might not openly be discriminating, they engage in acts like avoiding eye contact or, making assumptions about someone's intelligence. Mm-hmm. So you said an example of an everyday microaggression. The one that always pops into my head is when people ask me like, well, how did you get into this? Mm-hmm. And they're assuming that there has to be some sort of trauma in order for me, a Black woman, to be like in a position where I'm speaking to leaders or leading an organization, or, any kind of subject matter expert, right? Mm-hmm. That is one that like I get a lot. But everyday microaggressions can be all kinds of things, like what you mentioned earlier, Alexis. When I see you, I don't see color. We're all just, one with Mother Earth or whatever.
Yeah.
Color blindness is not the thing.
Mm-hmm. Or like, where are you from?
Yeah.
Where are you from? Yeah, like assuming that someone was not an American or, any ethnicity.
And even too, I mean, we're talking about racial bias, but there's gender bias too, and so
size bias, like age bias, it's everywhere. Mm-hmm.
I'm even thinking about misidentifying someone. That would be
misgendering on purpose.
Or misgendering, for sure.
Or
that's
even
violent.
Yeah, or even like how if you check into a hospital, they're like, okay, who's dad? When there's like a variety of families and situations, and that automatically shuts down conversation if that's, not how they identify.
Also, just like with lactation, and if I'm working with a family that has that's a same-sex family, I guess you could say, or a family that's transgender, not wanting to use their correct pronouns or using terms like mom and dad that are very hetero cis terms, can really do a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, yeah. Heteronormativity is killing lots of people and harming even more. So let's break that down. Just us three. We're going to take it on.
Sometimes it feels like that.
Well, even though this is not a birth podcast, we do, since we're in the birth world, I do think that we have a fair number of birth professionals that listen. So what suggestions do you have for them to start looking inward, to start building that self-awareness and identifying, what their own biases might be, and the work that they can start doing around unlearning that?
Yeah, so my best advice to birth workers or even just professionals who are looking to limit the effect of bias in their interactions is, awareness. So becoming aware of the habit and being motivated to change are like first steps to change any habit. And so bias is a habit, and it's something that we have to be aware of and constantly challenge ourselves against. I would say make sure that you're understanding the culture your client comes from and do that work beforehand and make it a part of your initial conversation and more fully meet your client's needs. Also, if you need to do research or you're asking questions in order to be a better person, make sure you're doing your self-work first and not just asking your Black friends or your person of color friends. And if you are asking them questions about their lived experiences, please pay them, buy coffee. Mm-hmm. Emotional labor is labor. Mm-hmm. And recognize what situations are magnifying stereotyping. So if you're in like a really homogenous friend group, look at that and look at why that is. Mm-hmm. Why are all your friends from school white? Why is your school mostly white? What practices, what legislation got you to that point? Because it's really hard to challenge your implicit bias if you're only hanging out with people that are exactly like you. So, decolonize your friend group a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I guess I will not take up all the time, but I will say counter-stereotypic exemplars are a really great tool to use in debiasing. So that. Can
you say that again? What was that word?
Counter-stereotypic exemplars.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't heard that.
What that means essentially is that you're thinking of positive examples of the people like that you've done this internal work. You've recognized, like, I have an issue with Black women. I have a hard time thinking of them positively right off the bat. How can I help myself do this? You think of your favorite, most amazing Black woman who's doing all the things, and you keep thinking about that woman. And you use that example to pop up. If you keep doing it, that will be the first thing that pops up into your head instead of coming up after you thought, a thought that you don't want to think. Mm. So that's a great tool for, debiasing.
Mm-hmm. I actually remember attending one bias training where like the initial activity that they had us do was like write down our main circle and like how many of those people were white, how many were Black, how many were from other cultures, to give you, like, literally writing it down gives you this visual of like mm-hmm. how much work you might need to do. So I appreciated what you shared around that because I remember that activity.
And then I think one last question or topic that we wanted to discuss, unless you have something, either Alexis or Jen, but something that we wanted to talk a little bit about is our children, because we are, after all, parents. And social scientists believe that kids begin to acquire prejudices and stereotypes as toddlers. Some studies show that it's as early as age 2 or 3. Kids can pick up terms of racial prejudice without really understanding how significant they are and and the harm they can do. Do you have any suggestions or tools that we as parents can use to check our own biases and privilege?
Oh.
Where to begin?
I know, right? So I think that we, as parents are just going to constantly fuck up, and we just have to own it. And I'm sure that y'all talk about this all the time, just being willing and enthusiastic about apologizing to our kids and explaining why what we said was wrong, because those explanations and those apologies stick with them even more than the original act. So working on your own bias, making sure that you're modeling, those apologies and giving real apologies, which is a skill that, we kind of miss sometimes, right? So we're apologizing for our actions, not for someone else's feelings. We're not explaining away our apology right after we give it. I'm sorry I said that, but this person did this and da-da-da. We're not doing that. So make sure that we're, modeling appropriate apologies and showing our kids that those thoughts are wrong, even if we said them, I think that that's important, making sure that kids know that it's okay to ask questions, because sometimes when our kids say something embarrassing, it's really tempting to just be like, okay, we're not going to talk about that now. Let's leave this room.
Right.
But making sure that they are aware in the moment that it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to, change their behavior based on new information.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that every now and again, it seems like on social media, a meme will go around or a message will go around from the parent of perhaps a differently abled child or somebody who may be on the autism spectrum or something, of their child exhibiting, let's just call it, behavior that society doesn't like to see kids do, but kids do anyway because they're kids. And just those questions about, well, this is how I think you should explain it to your child. Don't just, gloss it over, or like you said, don't say, okay, we'll talk about that when we leave the room. Have that conversation, even if it's hard. And so I really, really appreciate you bringing up that point especially.
Yeah, I mean, also, those people are probably never going to see you again. So at least leave them with a good impression. Go for it right in the moment. That's what helps me the most when I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this right now. You're like, these people are never going to see me again. I'll just be a story on their social media, and I'm cool with that. My kids will know better.
And even along those lines, too, I know there's been times where I'm trying to think of an example, and of course nothing's coming in my head, but it exists. But, there's a time where something happens in the moment, and I don't do what I ideally would want to do. So I make sure that that's not exactly the same as an apology, but circling back and saying, Mom did this wrong. So let's talk about this now. I should have done this way in the moment, but I didn't, and I was uncomfortable, and it came out this way instead. So let's talk about what I should have done differently. That's kind of related to the apology piece.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think modeling good apologies and modeling that behavior, that it's okay to mess up and not get things right the first time, is huge in general, especially when tackling something like this.
Absolutely.
Well, I know.
Do you have
great conversation?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have anything burning that you want to add or that we didn't cover?
No, I don't think I do.
Can you
check out Re+Birth Equity?
I was just going to say, can you plug Re+Birth Equity at all, or talk to people about how they can find you and how they can get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So Re+Birth has some really cool programming going on. We do adult sex education that goes beyond just anatomy. So our next one is on polyamory coming up, and we've done ones on pleasure. So that's a really cool series. And we do mobile mental health clinics quarterly that are going to rotate around the state. And those are really cool as well. Just drop-in therapy. So if you're in Texas or North Texas specifically, and you're looking for an organization to connect with, please check us out. We're at Re+Birth Equity on all of the things. And yeah.
Do y'all
if
ever
you need
come to
implicit
Austin?
bias training, email us.
Do y'all come to Austin and provide those trainings ever?
We do, yeah. I've done a few trainings in Austin.
Cool.
I love Austin, so I'll take almost any excuse.
We've actually, Naya and I have talked about for season 3 having an episode about polyamory, or just in general about relationships and how they can look really different than have quotations, what's the norm?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you just need to come back.
Because I think I'm not teaching that one. I'm real excited to be a part of the conversation for sure. But I think that, all of the norms in air quotes that we've established as a society are really like coming back to bite us right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because everything is normal,
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what you'd say is like ethical non-monogamy or like non-normative relationship types are really important to discuss, because what happens when we don't talk about things, people end up getting hurt or not understanding what's going on. And, I just go back to those, like my early, late teens, early 20s, where I didn't know anything about anything, and it felt like no one was talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard to progress and get better and be the person that baby boomers want you to be or whatever. When you don't know anything. And so, or when no one's talking to you about it because everything is so taboo. So let's just like get rid of all of that stigma and talk about everything. And that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah.
Preach.
Love it. Well, thank you, Jen.
My pleasure. I had so much fun.
We'll email you again about season 3.
Okay. Love y'all. Bye.
Bye. If the Top Knot Squad's content makes you laugh, nod in agreement, or makes you feel less alone, we'd love your support in the cost of producing this podcast. Visit patreon.com/TopKnotSquad to learn more about our budget-friendly sponsorship tiers and how you can help ensure that TKS has a future. Every little bit helps.
If you like what you hear, then be sure to click the subscribe button in your podcast app. While you're there, leave us a review. You can find us on social media. Just search for Top Knot Squad. We welcome your feedback and love making new friends.